Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicoast. We're recording this on June 22nd, 2017, and this is episode 40. We're middle-aged. Politicoast is a podcast that explores what's happening in British Columbia and across the country. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PoliticoastPod, and support the show at patreon.com/Politicoast.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian. We have a huge show today because we did 2 interviews, so let's jump in to segment 1, What Election Platform? Big day today. We finally had the legislature return. The speaker question was solved in a grand total of, it seemed like, 30 seconds when Liberal Steve Thompson from Kelowna Mission put his name forward and got dragged forward as the only person who wanted to be speaker.
Yeah, literally dragged forward as the tradition goes, where new speakers get escorted by 2 of their colleagues up to the speaker's chair. And this, just for a little bit of history, goes back to when speakers had the tendency to lose their head when they told the reigning monarch something they didn't want to hear. So it wasn't always a position that was sometimes accepted reluctantly, as may be the case here in a bit.
Well, Steve was sort of a surprise choice because he was actually appointed as forestry minister in Christy Clark's cabinet. And so people sort of assumed everyone put on the cabinet list was not going to step forward, but maybe he went, yeah, that sounds like fun. I'll do that.
Which means they need a new forestry minister.
Yeah, they've already appointed one. I didn't write down who it is because it doesn't really matter, let's be honest. But everyone kind of had to Google who Steve Thompson was right away. And he's such a political, like, it's rude to say nobody, but when you went to his Wikipedia page, it doesn't say what his age is exactly. It's like he's 64 or 65 or something. And it didn't even really highlight what elections he had won. So he's actually been an MLA since, I think, 2009 and been re-elected in Kelowna every time because Liberals in Kelowna can't lose. So all we really learned about him was what Christy Clark said during her sort of welcome Steve Thompson as speaker. You were a great rugby player. And she said something weird like, as I always say, we need more rugby players in politics, which...
Do we, though?
And who always says that? No one always says that. But that was a pet peeve. Anyway, Steve Thompson seems like he'll be fine as speaker. No one really knows. But what annoyed me is all the sort of coverage right away was like, Liberals appoint interim speaker. And I was like, none of that is true with how this system works. Like, the Liberals didn't appoint a speaker. Technically, as an individual MLA, he's put his name forward, and the whole House, well, they didn't vote because he was the only person to put his name forward, but the whole House elected him. And he's not an interim. He is the speaker.
Yeah, he's going to be in the job until the legislature dissolves or he resigns.
And everyone assumes he's going to resign.
Yeah, the rumor mill is the speaker's going to resign if the Liberal government falls, but, you know, that hasn't been confirmed, and that's by no means an automatic situation where that happens.
So Steve's in the speaker's chair. He got the fancy robe, and then by the afternoon he'd found the fancy hat, and so he's doing the fancy things with the fancy chair. And we got the Lieutenant Governor to read out the BC Liberals' speech from the throne, which might be their last one as government.
Was it the BC Liberals' speech from the throne? Because it sounded a lot like what the Greens and NDP's speech from the throne would have been.
So Maura Stillwell, one of the BC Liberal MLAs this last week, tweeted jokingly when they were leaking some of it, still finishing reading the NDP platform to see what else we can put in our speech from the throne. I thought she was joking, but they, like, in the first paragraph, talked about adding in electoral reform, like a referendum on it, putting the corporate union donation bans that had been leaked out earlier.
High-speed rail was in there, which I don't think I've ever heard the Liberals talk about.
And what actually was impressive about the political and donation reforms is they mentioned also reforming local governments, which there's been an outcry for a long time because there's basically no rules on municipal party donations, which is why Vancouver municipal elections are among the most expensive in the world. So applying all those same corporate union, third-party donations, and individual limits at the provincial level, also putting them at the municipal level, is great news. I mean, there's lobbying reform. There was talk about changing the election date to the fall, which was a Green and NDP call for a while. She explicitly talked about including ideas from all over BC, including all 3 parties. I mean, some of this was leaked earlier, this $1 billion for early childhood education, $100 a month increase for people with disabilities for their living expenses, something that hadn't been touched for a decade. Money for transit, like you said, money for housing.
Not just transit, but like new transit stuff that, the NDP might have talked about on the periphery, but, they talked about light rail in the South Island, so that's going to mean revisiting this thing that the NDP had vaguely floated around as something they might eventually like to look at.
A new passenger ferry from Nanaimo to Vancouver. Lots of just like little gifts to everyone, essentially. They're like, yeah, we found out we're actually going to have quite a bit of surplus, so money for everyone. We're going to cut the MSPs in half, and then we're going to do that NDP idea of starting up a panel to see how we can get rid of them.
And eliminate bridge tolls, too, rather than they're just cap it. So, not thrilled with that, but it's not quite as bad as their initial plan was.
They're even going to adopt the carbon tax increases of $5 a year until they hit, I think it was $50 per ton in 2022.
So that's actually just the federal plan. So that they've accepted the federal plan rather than...
Well, but I think they weren't going to start raising their carbon tax until other provinces caught up.
Oh, right, yeah. Sorry, that was $10 per year, and they're doing a little earlier at $5.
So they sort of switched towards some more NDP platform on that. They're also sort of walking back a little bit on the idea of bringing in ride sharing. So they still recognize that most people want ride sharing, but they're going to take the sort of more cautious approach that I think the NDP was calling for. And just sort of across all of this, it's really just a taunt to the other parties to say, hey, here's all the things you've put into your, agreement. Vote against them. We dare you.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. If you took out the bit about Site C and LNG, it's... Oh, and, the little bit of where you place the emphasis on kind of the growing economy versus, the kind of helping the less fortunate. The slight emphasis bits, if you took that out, it would have been indistinguishable from the speech that a slightly less ambitious NDP would have put forward.
I was going to highlight the Site C in there because that was something they leaned on hard. They basically went, we're going to have all these electric vehicles in the future. They mentioned that they're going to sort of endorse a City of Vancouver plan to have all electric vehicles in Metro Vancouver by 2035 or something.
That's not going to happen.
But to accommodate that, we need Site C. We need clean energy. And so that's where I think they drew their line of difference between them and sort of the Green DP alliance. But even there, I almost wonder if, as amendments come forward from the Greens and NDP, if they went, well, yeah, all right, we'll review it and sort of accept that to even further push the dare. We've done everything you want. What more do you want? And just really try to make it the NDP's fault if they can't get this through.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what the strategy here is. It's to give as much as possible and, adopt as many of the positions of the kind of NDPs and Greens that their base will let them get away with. And then when the vote goes against them, turn around and, blame it on them being, power hungry because, hey, we put the same policies they wanted out there and they voted it down anyway. So it's very much going to be they're just a bunch of power hungry people doing these backroom deals, which has been their talking point. And we offer to work with them. We made concessions, all of that stuff. And, it's them trying to, they probably won't use the word usurp, but that'll kind of be the subtext of it. And
sort of Harper 2008 anti-coalition rhetoric.
But it'll be that same sort of general message that this is about power, not principle.
Well, you've already had Horgan and Weaver step out to say they're not going to vote for this because they don't trust Christy Clarkin. So it's about trust. And yeah, fine, she's saying what we want to say, but she's not going to do it. You know that. Because, frankly, she's had a decade to do this kind of stuff, and who says she will now?
Yeah, and that's what's actually most shocking about it. What we alluded to in our segment title is this bears no resemblance to the election platform they put out just a couple months ago. And governments, they sometimes walk back their promises, but they don't exactly repudiate their entire platform a month and a bit into their new term.
Day one of the legislature, essentially. What I'm almost more curious about, and I saw this appear on Twitter today, the BC Conservatives tweeted a sort of they're all socialists now or something, and put a picture of Weaver, Horgan, and Christy Clark and try to paint them all as the same kind of socialists. This is a really great opportunity for them, as long as they can keep their shit together, to just basically say, what happened to the right wing of BC? And maybe the BC Conservatives can't do anything, but what about Liberals in this caucus who aren't so willing to give up everything that they've sort of fought for 20 years?
Well, I suspect this is only going to last as long as this current government does, and as soon as it falls on a confidence vote, this platform's just going to disappear, and you're going to revert back to the more traditional liberal approach, and might soften in a few areas, and whoever wins the inevitable leadership race will define it a bit. But I don't think this signals a huge change in direction for the Liberal Party, and their biggest problem right now isn't necessarily their policies. It's 16 years of government and all the, corruption and all those issues. And if you were to sketch out what the BC Liberals are in broad terms, it's something that resonates with a lot of British Columbians. And assuming they revert back to that sometime in the next 6 months to a year, I don't see that going anywhere.
Although then they're flip-flopping so much that how can you really rebuild any sort of reliability or trust under the same banner? Christy Clark. Yeah,
and Christy Clark will probably be out at that point, and new leader, new face. That was just the old leader doing all this flip-floppy stuff. Don't worry about it. This is what the BC Liberals are now, or today's BC Liberals, as they would say.
Tomorrow's BC Liberals now, or tomorrow's NDP. There's sort of different angles on this. I mean, I think the Conservatives, if they could get a couple Liberals to break ranks and vote against this throne speech, would be amazing, just for the extra political theater. I don't know if it will happen. I don't think they're strong enough to convince that to happen.
They, need a leader and proper organization at this point, which they're sorely lacking.
Well, an ambitious MLA could be leader tomorrow, pretty much.
Yeah.
In the legislature.
I think it would be pretty hard to do that, just because, the margins are so narrow. They want to try and get that shot at power. I can't see that changing.
And then the other thing I think is, for the sort of soft NDP voter in BC who's sick and tired of BC partisan politics for years, there's the sort of optimistic, if you forget the last decade of the Liberals, this is actually a platform they would probably want. Like, I looked at this, I listened to that speech, and I was like, this is not a mean speech. This is mostly support most of the things in there. It's just the voice who it's coming from. So if I take that aside, could the NDP actually get more of its policies through by sort of calling Christy Clark's bluff and saying, all right, we'll go with you. We'll let you do this. And
the moment you don't, we're defeating your government.
Every vote will be, 85, 87 votes for the NDP platform.
That would actually be quite an interesting move on Horgan's part. I mean, he's already raised the specter, we don't trust this. But, yeah, if he actually called the bluff, and they have the votes to bring down the government at any time. And
well, now there's a Liberal speaker, so they're one vote short.
Yeah, so, if they did call the bluff, they could absolutely push it through. And, the moment they don't is the moment that falls. Though I'm not entirely sure on what the confidence convention is around the BC legislature and whether or not you can just trigger a non-confidence vote at any time.
But in all likelihood, the Greens and NDP have signed this pact, and for as strong as it is with the sort of number they'll have, I see them bringing forward the amendments, doing the debate, and finally having the confidence vote either next week or a little bit later if the Liberals manage to drag it out. And then we'll get to have Judy Guichon give this same throne speech, basically, but in the NDP's term instead of in the Liberals' words.
So ultimately, was this a win for Christy Clark, do you think?
I think this was a lot of delay tactics. It's probably going to be ignored by most British Columbians. I think most people, and we had this Angus Reid poll this last week, where most British Columbians want Christy Clark to just accept defeat. They don't want to go to another election. I think they're tired of politicking. We're obviously going to end up in another election soon enough, but people want probably to see Horgan and Weaver, since they came to a deal, just get on with it. And so I don't think Christy Clark's done herself a lot of damage, but it's not as helpful as I think she thinks it is.
Yeah, I just don't see this really changing the course of BC politics too much one way or the other. I think the bigger long-term question is what's the effect of this flip-flop going to be on the BC Liberal Party, and what the almost certain and inevitable defeat of the Liberal government will mean going forward. And, we already saw a little bit of tension this week between Horgan and Weaver on the question of union certification. Specifically, the NDP in their platform had promised to go from the current secret ballot method of certifying unions BC to a card check system, and Weaver's said no to it. It wasn't in the agreement they hatched, and anything that's not in their agreement, the Greens are free agents on. And this is a fairly public break fairly early on, and from a pure politics point of view, it's probably good, because the big long-term risk for Weaver is the Greens become indistinguishable from the NDP, and at that point, why vote Green at all?
Yeah, I think both leaders managed to sort of come out relatively unscathed. I know there was a lot of attempt to make this a big fiasco of like a feud. Oh, the agreement's already falling apart. I'm like, it wasn't even in the agreement. I think we should come back to the sort of policy question maybe in a bigger, long form. But in terms of, and we have a whole Twitter thing, you can go see our debate on that, where other people jumped in.
Yeah, it's the first time I've woken up to 80 notifications on Twitter.
There's lots we can talk about there, but in terms of the politics of the agreement, I think they played it right. I mean, what they said going in to this agreement was, these are the things we agree on, and we're going to try to do as an NDP government supported by the Greens. Everything else goes to the House, and whoever can muster a majority of the votes, it'll go through. So if the Greens have legislation they want to work with the Liberals on, they're free to. If the NDP wants to work with the Liberals on legislation, which I don't see
Can't see that happen in
the legislature, but maybe it'll happen with this throne speech, because now Horgan can keep going back and being like, well, you said in June you were in favor of this, now you're not.
That's probably a reason why, if the government does fail soon, Christy Clark should step down as leader immediately, and they get an interim leader in to break with that a bit. It's going to be a little harder to do, but at least if there's somebody else saying, hey, no to this, it distances themselves a bit from that if they want to oppose these measures.
I just think the best thing about today is it finally ends this weeks of pointless but fun at times, I guess, speculation about all kinds of constitutional trivia, as it were, and now we can actually go, oh, all right, that's solved. We don't need to worry about who's the speaker right now, because we have that. We don't need to worry about, can the BC Liberals bring through a throne speech. We still have some questions about, if she loses a confidence vote, what the Lieutenant Governor does, and I think Gary Mason in the Globe and Mail's been more on she should just throw it to an election, because can't trust that this agreement will hold through.
Which is, no, that's not how it works. It is technically the Lieutenant Governor's decision, but the general consensus on this sort of thing is, if it's pretty much immediately after an election, you ask someone else if they can hold the confidence of the House and form a government.
Yeah, so a little bit more speculation, and that, I guess, gives us at least a couple more episodes to keep talking about BC.
Yeah, there was a part of me that was slightly disappointed they did resolve the speaker impasse, because I did kind of want to see the constitutional questions play out a bit, even if it's mostly for my own entertainment, and there's no reason we should be going back to the polls this soon.
So we'll look forward to a week of debate over a throne speech, potentially some legislation coming through. The Liberals do have the ability to put that corporate union donation ban to a bill before we even get to a confidence vote, so that in theory that could pass, because a bill can get through very quickly if there's unanimous consent. But I feel like changing the election rules, you do actually want to study it. We have multiple other jurisdictions to just crib from, but BC I feel is so Wild West that you need to sort of look at these laws before you just sweep them in. I guess one last question I'll put to you. One other weird speculation I heard is the speaker could make things really complicated by ejecting some members if things get rowdy in the next week. Do you think that's anything beyond a remote absurd likelihood? And that if, say, the speaker decided, or rugby playing speaker decided a couple NDP members were too rowdy in one of these debates, then the scales would tip for the Liberals passing their budget?
I think that's very unlikely.
And set some dangerous constitutional...
Yeah, especially because, assuming that the speculated resignation of the speaker happens when the government falls, one of the ideas that was kicked around a fair bit was that the NDP would put up a speaker, and that speaker might start acting in a somewhat partisan manner, and it's going to be in everyone's mind going forward, and the Liberals do not want to be the first one to break that convention, because they're probably going to try and hammer the NDP pretty hard on it if it does actually happen. And because of that, the only way I can see this idea that's of the speaker ejecting someone actually happening is if it's unbelievably blatant and every reasonable person can see that, oh yeah, no, this guy needed to go.
And I think everyone's going to be pretty well behaved for the next week just to at least get to that vote. Things get tense.
Yeah, that's the thing. Nobody wants to become the story this week.
Well, we'll have lots more to talk about on BC Politics next week. Now let's go to a couple interviews. First, we spoke with Brendan Daw of Abundant Housing Vancouver. Hi, Brendan. Thanks for sitting down with us today. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself, what Abundant Housing Vancouver is.
Hi, I'm Brendan. I'm a renter from East Vancouver. So Abundant Housing Vancouver is a group of advocates who are here to help educate people on the ways in which we aren't meeting the demand for housing, and to advocate for more housing. Because, I think whatever your perspective on what the particular cause of the housing crisis is, that we're better off with more than less. More housing means more competition for landlords. It means more opportunities for people to live. It's, more people are able to access the things that we like about Vancouver.
So when did Abundant Housing start, and what was the origin of it?
It started roughly 1 year ago. There was a lot of online conversations, and people said, well, I may as well stop complaining on the internet, and why don't we all get together and go down to a public hearing and tell the city council that we want them to approve this rental project and rental housing projects like that, given that that there's something like 7 vacant rental units for every 1,000 units available. It's a really bad situation. So there needs to be more rental housing. And so that was the origin of Abundant Housing there. It's spiraled from there. So people got together after that, and we make this a permanent thing. We'll get people involved. We'll get people activated and try to build a political case for more housing.
What's that look like? What is the sort of policy goals you're hoping to see change? What's the vision?
Well,
that's lots of big and small questions at the same time, but
sure, I can take big and small answers. The small answer would be that we want the city to do more about the rental housing crisis. It's, as I said, the crushingly low vacancy rates that mean that landlords it's a landlord's market. They can raise rents, they can treat people poorly, and this is bad for tenants. This is bad for people who want to live here. It's a general negative. It causes rents to go up. And that can be accomplished by building more rental housing, by building more rental housing in more ways that enable that to be done more cheaply and more widely. And so the long-term goal for Abundant Housing Vancouver is that we have a more equitable use of space in the city. You look at, it's something, what was it, like 20% of the population lives on 80% of the land, and that is enforced by law through low-density zoning. What we currently have, most of the city is encumbered by single-family zones or in other districts that prohibit the construction of much more affordable apartment buildings, and we'd like to see that change, both in the city and across the region.
Is it just rental housing you're focused on, or is there now some market housing that people are looking to purchase?
Rental housing is I think something that we can all agree is the area of most agreement, and it's where the most pressing crisis is. But that doesn't preclude that there's also, of course, there's an important role for ownership housing. But that's something that we have, most internal agreement on, and something that we most want to focus on as something that needs to be fixed.
Can you talk maybe a bit about some of the day-to-day activities of the organization? Like, I know you were involved in the character home zoning review. What was abundant housing and your contribution to those kind of discussions?
So the character home zoning review, we put together our complaints, and our main complaint is that the character home zoning review was taking very large swaths of town, much of it on the west side, but also some on the east side, that have abundant access to jobs, to education, to amenities, and downzoning them, and meaning that then locking that down into the future. And we didn't think at the time that it was a good idea to lock large areas of the city down with lower density when we should be exploring ways to increase the density of these neighborhoods. And so we thought that some of the proposals in the character zoning proposal were a bad idea. Now, we're not against character houses. They're nice, they're great. You can renovate them to make them more accommodating, but this was a broad brush proposal that everything near a character house was going to be downzoned, and we didn't think that was the way forward for the city. So what we did about that is we circulated an open letter. It was signed by a lot of planning experts, by economists, by random folks in the city who agreed, and got that before people. And I think it had some impact on the character home zoning review.
And just for a little context, what was the outcome of the review?
Well, the review is ongoing, but one of the things that the city did do is they seem to have dropped the proposal to downzone large swaths of the city as part of this, and making it much more about incentives to retain character homes with, expanded units, with additions, with bigger and more marketable laneways to create greater incentives for people to preserve these lovely old houses.
Another ongoing consultation with the city is the sort of Canby corridor, their long-term vision of how to densify along the Canada Line and vital transit access. What's your sort of take on the plan as it stands, and where should it be going?
Well, the Canby corridor plan has a lot of great things about it. And there's a lot of things where we really think that the city hasn't gone far enough, given the scale of the crisis we find ourselves in. Allowing a lot more apartment buildings, even in places where they were previously not allowed, is definitely something that we applaud. But you look at the zoning, you got areas where it's only 1 block away from Canby Street, and the most that they want to allow in there is townhouses. Townhouses are good. It's better than single-family zoning, but it, again, doesn't meet the scale of the crisis we find ourselves in. And if you want to go build a townhouse, I don't have any problem with that, but I don't think that we should be limiting things just to townhouses, which, it's going to be, instead of a $2 million home, maybe it'll be a $800,000 townhouse. That's an improvement, and we're for baby steps and improvements, but I think that there's more push out there, and there's more need there to go bigger.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but there's still areas that are within walking distance of the Canada Line stations that are still going to be single-family houses, right?
You are correct.
In the Douglas Park area, I know that there was some recent controversy about one development there, but the overall plan for that area still keeps most of it low density, correct?
That is indeed correct. And, I believe that transit experts hold that you can walk about 800 meters to a train station, 400 meters to a bus. And you go 800 meters in Vancouver, well, you're kind of at the next bus. It's not very far from everything. And so the idea that these areas, just couldn't support transit-oriented development, I think is pretty questionable. But there are some good things they're doing, some more support for rental housing, and more, the idea to build out in the Oak Ridge area that'll provide a lot of access for people, a lot of places to live in sustainable lifestyles.
Do you see the city as focusing too much on allowing new condo buildings versus rental housing, or do you sort of have a distinction in your mind between those?
I think that there's a certain extent to which when you're saying, is it too many condos or is it too many rental buildings, it's fighting over the scraps. Because when 76% of the city or something like that doesn't allow condos or rental buildings in the first place, what we're doing is we're squeezing all the demand for multifamily living into a few narrow corridors. Canby corridor, arterial frontage, i.e. along the busy major streets that are full of diesel pollution, and in existing multifamily areas. You can think of the area around Metrotown where they're tearing down, affordable old walk-ups and replacing them with condo towers. That doesn't have to be that way. You can notice that the area you're allowed to build, big condo towers in Burnaby is basically old industrial sites. Let's displace jobs, or multifamily areas, let's displace tenants. Nowhere in there is a single family homeowner going to, worry about, a condo going up next door.
Yeah, that's also true for a lot of the areas right around their stations, too. Along the Millennium Line, there's several areas there that have SkyTrain stations and basically no towers. So there's definitely a lot of room to improve. But kind of building off of this, you hear a lot about the right kind of supply. Do you think that really should be a city priority, or should it be less about what we build and more just about building more?
Well, I always like to ask, who are we planning for? And right now, in most of the region, we are planning for fairly wealthy people. And so, well, we don't quite know what the right kind of supply will mean as the city is developing their housing strategy. There's definitely a point to ask, like, are we planning for people who can afford to live and work here, or are we planning for the wealthy? And there's a lot more passive, de facto, inertial planning for the wealthy than I think we need.
So you faced a bit of pushback on a few areas. One of the main ones is that some critics say that densification of existing low-income neighborhoods will lead to gentrification or exacerbate the gentrification that already exists. How would you respond to those criticisms?
Well, let's not do that then. Let's densify Dunbar. Let's densify Point Grey. Let's densify Shaughnessy. Let's densify plenty. There's no shortage of neighborhoods that are mostly full of wealthy homeowners in the region. We don't have to.
Do the sort of opposite of gentrification almost.
I mean, I'm not going to pretend that if you were to permit apartments in Point Grey tomorrow, that they would be, super affordable housing. But it would mean that people who move there aren't, bidding up the price of rents in Fairview, and the people who aren't bidding price of rents up there who find homes aren't bidding them up in Hastings Sunrise, and then the people there aren't bidding them up in Metrotown. It's a region-wide goal of improving access to housing for everyone, and that is helped. As my friend Jens likes to say, a hermit crab moves into a larger shell. Well, the next largest hermit crab takes the old shell. It tends to work that way with rental market access as well.
One of my sort of hesitations on the supply question, I get the theory and it makes sense and it feels like it should work. But when I look at every other major city in the world, I don't feel like anyone has successfully done it. Or do you think there are cities we can look at where they have managed to increase supply to make it more affordable in the city?
Well, I think that there are a number of examples. Tokyo is sort of the one that many people like to look at as this place where you can mostly just build housing. And you can build shops in that housing. You don't need some workaround for a 100-year-old zoning code to allow someone to open a corner store in your houses. And so, Tokyo has a very high housing start rate and, a relatively high population growth rate. And this is accommodated through single-family homes, through apartments, through condos, all on varying size lots on narrow streets. And it works. And it's this development pattern that's very transit-oriented, that's, if they weren't tearing down so many houses for the sake of building new houses, would be relatively sustainable and accommodates people. If I wanted to take a somewhat more tenuous example, I'd say Houston is an interesting case. Now, Houston succeeds in spite of, you compare it to its peer cities or places like Dallas and Atlanta, and they've all got the giant freeways that are, massively publicly funded that encourage huge amounts of unsustainable and sprawl. But at the same time, Houston is able to accommodate people in ways that Dallas or Austin aren't, because you can build a townhouse or an apartment building in most residential areas of Houston. It's not a fight to get these things done because there's no law against them.
And in fact, Austin might be an interesting counterpoint, because they're both same region of the country, but Austin has a very strict zoning code where Houston doesn't. Correct?
Yeah, and that's not endorsing, the Houston way of life of driving down enormous freeways, but it's, you're right, that does produce a very interesting sort of test case, the very heavily zoned, regulated city and the one that's fairly easy with apartments and townhomes, and, which one is doing a better job of attracting people for opportunity. Seems to be the Houston's doing it.
And so would you be looking at something like I believe it's the Hong Kong Transit Authority, Transit Company, whatever their TransLink version is, there where they actually own the land above the subway stations and use the rents from that to gain a lot of their funding and support the system?
I mean, it's a bit beyond sort of our focus, but talking into transit funding. But I mean, why not? I mean, it creates a lot of value. Why don't we use some of that value to fund it?
Right. So I realize Abundant Housing Vancouver hasn't put a position on it, but that's the sort of land value capturing that you'd be looking at, or something a little different.
I guess you could say that we haven't created a policy platform on that, but more just I think a direction that we should focus.
Is there anything else you wanted to bring up?
I'd just like to let people listening at home know that if they're curious about Abundant Housing Vancouver, you can find us on Facebook, on Twitter, on apparently Instagram, and of course at abundanthousingvancouver.com. Go and use our fancy new letter writing tool to give you some inspiration to write a letter to City Council telling them that they should approve more rental housing. It's fun. We just started it up the other day.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Hey, join us is Micah to talk about the lawsuit that the Vancouver Terrarium has brought against the Park Board over the cetacean ban.
You give us a little bit of the background.
Sure. I am here. I'm going to, by the way, thank you very much for bringing me back, boys. Yeah, I'll talk to you a little bit about the decision to ban cetaceans, new cetaceans specifically, from Stanley Park. I'm going to give you a little bit of background here. November 16th and 25th, 2 resident beluga whales in the aquarium's custody died. This was probably the catalyst. It's mentioned by a number of the Parks Board commissioners as the catalyst behind this decision to ban new cetaceans from the aquarium. There are currently 2 cetaceans under the aquarium care. In fact, there used to be 3, but I believe last week another cetacean passed away, Daisy the porpoise. So that leaves Helen the dolphin and Chester the false killer whale. And then the aquarium also owns a number of belugas that are on loan to other facilities. January 2017, a motion on cetaceans was referred by the Parks Board commissioners to the staff of the Parks Board. And then the staff reports back using internal mechanisms and produces 4 options, one of which is to have a motion essentially banning new cetaceans from Stanley Park. The Parks Board, of course, has jurisdiction. I'll get into this a little bit more in a moment, but the Parks Board has jurisdiction over what goes on inside of Stanley Park, with a number of limitations, of course, dealing with federal and provincial jurisdictions. Insofar as the aquarium's concerned, really it's the Park Board's say. The motion that the Parks Board decides to move through, on my reading, is to allow the now 2 cetaceans to remain in the aquarium with performances prohibited, and to ban any other cetaceans from coming in. The aquarium, for their part, is, they're battling hard. They're building a bigger aquarium space for these animals, and they say they're willing to phase out the display of belugas by the end of 2029. And the Parks Board effectively gives them the classiest middle finger you could give somebody.
Well, to the aquarium's credit here, they've been working with previous Parks Boards on this expansion plan. This wasn't like a surprise to the Parks Board. It was like a communal, let's get together, and then suddenly, you're right.
This is one of the issues with new elections, let's just say, that Parks Boards change, commissioners change, their views change.
Democracy is messy.
Democracy is messy. I'm just going to talk really briefly about the concerns on both parts. So the overarching concern on the Parks Board is that cetaceans really don't belong in this aquarium. They draw an equivalence here, or there's a comparison between cetaceans living in the aquarium and polar bears that were on exhibit at the Vancouver Zoo. They say that they're both just equally problematic. The flip side of the coin from the aquarium, one argument that's going on here is whether or not cetaceans will be able to have long-term care, particularly those that are not releasable. The Parks Board really contends this point. I admit that I'm not sure which side has it. They both seem to be absolutely certain that they have it right, but the aquarium says that, there's also going to be decreased revenue at the aquarium, that the awareness of cetaceans will go down, there will be a massive loss of expertise. So we get to the good stuff. The May 15 Parks Board meeting. This thing is S-class political theater. I mean, it is unbelievable. If you listen carefully to this webcast, you can hear protesters screaming for the entire duration of the meeting. It's amazing. It's surreal. It's a Parks Board meeting. Each of the councillors takes a turn speaking. There was no public input, which will matter when we get to the petition that was filed by the aquarium. But one of my favorite parts, the whole process leading from January until now, if I understand what the Parks Board is saying, the commissioners had all been unanimous. They had all been on the same page, passing all these motions through unanimously. And then Councillor Shum at the Parks Board meeting just flips a 180, feels like she can't support the motion because it would increase the likelihood of injured animals because the decision was based on politics, as if her decision isn't political, being on the Parks Board. She's effectively reading from the talking points of the Vancouver Aquarium. And people in the gallery were like legitimately shocked. Like it was as if someone had slapped them in the face. They were shouting shame at her as if she's Cersei Lannister taking a walk of shame. And then the other councillors take turns talking, really patting themselves on the back for this decision. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing really much more that needs to be said other than this was unbelievable political theater. And then when the decision was passed through, people were applauding and like throwing papers in the air like it was high school graduation. Okay, so let's get to the legal argument. The aquarium retained extremely competent counsel, Randall Hordo from Nathanson Schachter, and the pleadings that he filed are interesting. What they're really seeking to do is to quash this bylaw, and they are, to put it lightly, up against it. The Supreme Court of Canada came down with a decision in 2012 saying that really municipal councils should be given wide deference. They actually softened the language. This is, of course, a decision by my beloved Beverly McLaughlin, Chief Justice, who's stepping down. She called for wide deference, although not carte blanche reference, to be given to municipal councils. This softens the language of the British Columbia Court of Appeal, which said that municipal councils should be given the highest deference. So still really powerful decision. If you're going to be overturning a municipal council's decision, you need to have a really good basis. And the Vancouver Charter explicitly gives the power to the Parks Board to decide whether animals and which animals should be confined, exhibited, and accommodated in parks. And it explicitly includes Stanley Park, as if that charter was really written for this purpose. And I assume it probably was, that section would have been amended. So the aquarium's argument. The aquarium's argument concentrates on section 490 of the Vancouver Charter, which states that the Parks Board can enter into lease agreements with third parties on parkland. Now, I don't want to bore you with the real technical details of this argument, but the section has the effect of deferring at least some decision-making powers from the park onto the leasee. And that's Hordo's thrust. That's really the thrust of his argument, is that the lease agreement signed between these two parties hands over these decisions that otherwise would have been made by the park board to the aquarium. According to 5C of this lease agreement, which I admit I haven't seen, the park board promised not to interfere with the day-to-day administration of the aquarium unless the interference is permitted by the agreement. I'll just sort of pause there to say this is going to be Hordo's strongest argument. His second argument is procedural, that it was unfair for the Parks Board in making its decision on May 15th not to consider the aquarium's perspective, not to invite anyone from the aquarium to speak.
Or even members of the public, it sounds like.
That's right, not members of the public, although one would argue that Commissioner Shum said everything that the aquarium would have otherwise said. At least that's my own personal view. The second argument from the process is that without the aquarium, the elected body wasn't informed and the bylaw was unreasonable. The third argument out of four is that the amendment was unacceptably vague, and my favorite argument is that the bylaw amendment violates the aquarium's right to free expression. Now, Hordo's a smart man, and I'm sure that he has authority for this basis. The argument is that the aquarium's practice only expresses one viewpoint, and the bylaw undermines the program and its ability to educate and engage students and researchers. So here's the last thing I'll say on this. It isn't the first time the Parks Board and the aquarium have gotten into a mess. In 2014, there was another legal spat over the Parks Board decision to ban cetacean breeding in Stanley Park. That lawsuit has gone nowhere. And if I'm going to take off my legal hat for 1 second, these sorts of lawsuits are really good for two things. Number one, fundraising, because they're a way to keep people engaged, like you're fighting for something. And the second reason is for political pressure. As we just mentioned, democracy is messy. There's going to be a new round of by-elections, I think 2018.
2018,
yeah, so next year. The aquarium is probably going to try to get as many helpful voices out there running, and they're going to impose a lot of political pressure. So it is said that all politics is local, and I don't think that you can get any more local than this, or frankly, any more humorous than this. So it'll be very interesting. I'll keep my eye out for the response to this petition. I'm not sure when it's going to come out, but it should shape up to be a pretty interesting municipal law decision coming through the pipes.
With the obvious caveat that you haven't seen the response to it, just sum it up. Does the aquarium have a case, and are they likely to prevail?
There's no certainties in litigation. If there's one thing that I could possibly get through here, you will never know what's certainly going to happen. Given the authority in Catalyst, which is the Supreme Court of Canada case I was referring to earlier, I just don't see an avenue of that working, given the high amount of deference given to municipal councils and what is explicitly stated in that Vancouver charter. It's hard for me to see a path to victory, but I would not underestimate somebody as skilled as Mr. Hordo.
You said the most likely of the sort of four arguments to succeed is that first one about the lease agreement. And I guess that makes sense because it has to deal with the agreement they've entered. Do you think that agreement would be held up as we should defer to the Parks Board that passed this agreement, or defer to the Parks Board that's quote-unquote breaking it?
It just seems strange that the Parks Board would hand over their authority over something like this. Like, I understand that the day-to-day administration was handed over to the aquarium, and I'll take them at their word on those pleadings. Is the decision to ban cetaceans from the park a day-to-day administrative duty? To me, it doesn't sound that way. And as I've said before, I haven't had the privilege of reading the license agreement. I'll put it this way. I can't see a license agreement putting the decision-making power over whether or not cetaceans would be able to live inside of an aquarium, to put that decision-making power in the hands of the aquarium. That doesn't feel right to me. I don't see why the Parks Board would abdicate that kind of power, and I also don't understand what the language would look like to abdicate that kind of power. And I'll say one other thing. Of course, the Parks Board would have looked and looked and looked and made sure that they had legal authority to do this. And they have competent counsel too. It just seems hard for me to believe that this would be a silver bullet argument if the Parks Board hadn't really considered this. To answer your question specifically, I'm not sure how that licensing agreement is going to work. Until I see that agreement, who knows?
Well, it's not exactly unheard of for politicians to go off on a direction they want to, whether or not there's the legal basis. So I'll push back slightly on there's no way the Parks Board would go ahead with this if they didn't have the legal authority. Now, it's very likely they have the legal authority, but, it's politics. And
absolutely. I don't disagree with you at all, Scott, and I'm sorry if my words were if I expressed them that way. You're right. Like, I'm sure both sides see some virtue in going ahead. That's why you're never certain in litigation. I'm just saying that the Parks Board would have been very confident that they would have been able to uphold this decision.
Do you think there's any grounds then to that second procedural argument beyond just their claim that felt unfair? I know admin law is both very complex and boring to non-lawyers, but also a very hot and controversial place to lawyers. So answer my question without getting too in the weeds.
Sure. I don't think there's a great basis to that argument. The aquarium was welcome at a number of previous meetings, although, to be honest with you, I'm not sure when those meetings happened and what the process was, but I do understand that the aquarium was invited to speak before that. And all the commissioners that voted in favor of the cetacean ban, if you want to call it a cetacean ban, they all said that they were really informed about this decision. And that leads me to believe that the aquarium would have presented over and over and over again.
You did mention the free expression one. You chuckled a bit when you mentioned it. Why, I suppose, and what makes this such a long shot?
So I'm thinking about a judge that's like close to retirement, like maybe like Justice Burnett, for example, and he hears the argument and, you know, the first three aren't winning, and then like this charter argument comes up and you're opening up Pandora's box. Who's really going to be enjoying listening to that? Like, these arguments are so technical and so involved, and trying to move a municipal decision about animals in an aquarium over to the realm of freedom of expression because you are no longer able to express a viewpoint since those animals aren't there. Like, I chuckle because I can only imagine the scorn a judge might have hearing this argument, and that scorn makes me laugh because it would just be funny to see a judge that's close to retirement having to interact with this argument. But again, as I said before, I am nowhere near the seniority of Mr. Hordo, who is a legend in this city, and I can only assume if he's putting this in his pleadings, he has a basis for doing so, but it is still entertaining to see that.
If it does make it past the BC courts and on all the way to the Supreme Court, do you think...
I'm crossing my fingers to everyone listening on the radio.
Do you think the free expression claim has any chance at the Supreme Court level?
Look, I think that it's a very, passionate, fun area to argue. If this case goes to trial, I will be surprised. If this case gets appealed, I will be very surprised. If this case makes it to the show, I will be shocked. And if the basis for the appeals all the way up the line is freedom of expression, the freedom of expression argument, I'll take you both out for beers.
Let's maybe just close with some thoughts on the timeline. So going forward, I'm assuming this slows down the Parks Board's ability to act. Not at all?
No. The Parks Board will still be able to act. What the aquarium might try to do is to launch an injunction to say, okay, but let's keep the status quo for now. Let's have an injunction against this bylaw. And for now, let's just keep things as is until the main question is tried. I'm not sure whether that would succeed. I have my own personal doubts, but let's talk about actually the next steps. Procedurally, the Parks Board is going to respond to this petition, and then there's going to be all kinds of discoveries. But if the indication of the other outstanding case can give us some guidance as to what's going to happen, the answer is probably almost nothing. There will be a response, there will be endless discoveries, and the Parks Board will have a new by-election, and the aquarium will decide where to go from there.
So there's no chance this will hit trial before October 2018, you would say?
I won't say no chance. I will say slim chance. How about that? I mean, procedurally, the cetacean ban should get to trial first, and that was filed 3 years ago. So you would think that maybe they would be heard together, but let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Until I see some trial date filed, until we read that in the news, I don't see anything really happening.
So if we get a new, say, pro-aquarium Parks Board in, is it just as simple a matter for them to just pass a new motion repealing this bylaw? That's
a really good question, actually. My understanding is that they probably would be able to do that because it is a bylaw. And they're how could it be that you would have one council binding the hands of another council? I know that there is authority to say you can't do that. So one would think that would happen, or to be
lawyerly.
Yeah, to be lawyerly. I think that a new Parks Board would be able to amend the bylaws back to the way they were pre-2014 or however far back you want to go.
Okay, so I guess we'll have to keep an eye out for what's going to happen on this one, and for once, I guess, pay attention to the Parks Board election.
Hey, that may be let's just say that I haven't been a huge fan of the Parks Board's recent decision to ban free yoga. I mean, this is a personal thing, but free yoga at Dude Chilling Park. It's Dude Chilling Park. That's where free yoga goes. That's where you have it.
It makes more sense than the Burrard Bridge.
Yeah, I think so. Om at the park better than Om at the bridge. I wasn't really a big fan of that decision, but here's an argument for accountable Parks Board commissioners. Right here, the idea that you have people who are deciding what goes on at the park. Now, it's a legit argument, and this is probably for another day. The idea that the city should really be making these decisions because they get blamed one way or another for decisions made by the Parks Board. I mean, I think you guys could probably do a deep dive on that one day, because that is a really important question to figure out whether we really do need this Parks Board to make decisions like this.
Thanks again for joining us.
My pleasure. Bush and Scott, thanks for bringing me back, boys.
No problem.
Anytime.
All right, we're going to close off this episode with our usual quick takes. First, there was a story earlier this week in iPolitics about a attempt back in September by the political advocacy director of the Canadian Labour Congress to essentially try to oust Thomas Mulcair. Mulcair lost his leadership vote in the spring, sort of spent the summer in France, and everyone was kind of in the NDP feeling a bit anxious because Ron Ambrose was doing really well for the Conservatives, being a very visible face of the party. Their leadership race was starting to simmer up, and the NDP was like, what's going on? And so I think some people in Labour really wanted to see any action happen. And I guess what they managed to do is talk Nathan Cullen into agreeing, even though he wasn't in favour of kicking Mulcair out, he agreed that if Mulcair left, he would step up as interim leader. Cullen, very popular NDP MP here in BC, probably would have brought a lot of attention to the party. The director of the Canadian Labour Congress started essentially getting a phone bank together to call NDP MPs to say, all right, I think we have enough votes. If we can guarantee it, will you vote, sort of a no confidence in Mulcair, and we'll boot him. And they had David Christopherson on board, Aaron Weir and Brian Mass, and they sort of all got up and spoke at this, or sort of caucus meeting that Mulcair called. But when they called Nikki Ashton, she actually tipped off Thomas Mulcair about this sort of plot, this almost backroom coup, and he managed to sort of bring it out in the open and just go and kill it. Have a couple people spoke against him, let them air their grievances, as it were. And I think there were some news stories about this sort of stuff at the time, like grievances are being aired. But in the end, it dissipated, and people got their frustrations out, and then they got caucus solidarity again, and they sort of all came out and went, no, we're with Mulcair until we finally get a new leader. And I bring this story up mostly because it's sort of interesting to see the inner workings, and I find Nikki Ashton's role in it really interesting because she's taking the sort of, the NDP needs to be a bigger movement right now in the leadership race, whereas that to me is, we need to break with what Mulcair's sort of leadership, which was the professional political party that's really boring and bland and middle of the road. But then she was sort of a good ally for Mulcair in this situation. So it's a tense, interesting situation.
I can see a couple of strategic reasons why, though. For one, if you actually have the embodiment of the thing you're running against still there, it's a lot easier to point to that later on and say, yes, this is the sort of thing we need to get rid of. And also, if they ousted Mulcair, a little while after they'd already passed the vote to remove him as permanent leader, it would make the NDP look super disorganized and incompetent, and just a lot of kind of internal party troubles. And if you want to then lead the party, that's maybe not the sort of thing you want to have be the narrative of the NDP going into the leadership race.
Well, and I think you definitely don't want to be the person with blood on your hands going into the race, because it just raises all these questions that sort of complicate it and mess things up. And even if you are trying to portray yourself as different, being the person who kicked him out and stabbed him in the back, it's messy. And it's like, well, you're clearly just running for the power. But here it's like, all right, we have a system. We will follow the system through. And so I think she kept herself clean on it. It's probably the right decision in the end.
So the Governor General's been in the news for a couple of different reasons. One of them is he's weighed in on the question about the Constitution and whether or not we should be looking at kind of reopening the debate on it and perhaps amending it. So as we talked about a couple weeks ago now, the Quebec government came out with a policy paper basically saying, hey, we want to revisit this constitutional question that's been kind of simmering in the background since the 80s, and, well, arguably much longer, but this particular set of reforms, definitely since the 80s. And the Governor General said, yeah, there's room for continual debate, and, we should be doing this. And I think that annoyed a lot of people because, it's the Governor General, he's kind of there to just do the ceremonial stuff and very much not be political, and this is a political question.
I heard someone describe him as Canada's mascot. That said, I don't disagree with his comments. Like, they weren't taking a side on what changes should be made, but just that constitutions should be living documents, and we should be able to discuss them. That's not really controversial, but I think you're absolutely right that as the figurehead, as the representation of the power of the Queen in this country, which we are still a monarchy, keep your mouth shut. Just say the pleasantries. Say Canada's great.
Yeah.
Finish it.
And it's worth remembering that a lot of the stuff we think of as the Prime Minister's powers are technically the Governor General's powers that he exercises on the Prime Minister's behalf. And as such, it's not a reassuring sign that the Governor General is coming to a different public position than the Prime Minister is.
Well, and at the same time, he made a few more comments. I think this was also on an interview with CBC's The House, where he talked about the, quote, indigenous, unquote, people of Canada who also immigrated here, but 10 to 14,000 years ago instead of 100 to, 300 or 400. And I get, again, where he was sort of trying to come with, like, Canada's this nation of people from all around the world. But it got a lot of pushback from Indigenous people who point out this is a narrative that's been used repeatedly by sort of colonial British settlers to say, you don't really have any more right to this land than we do, and now we're all getting along, so shut up and deal with it. And it sort of delegitimizes the grievances of Truth and Reconciliation.
Yeah, I think the quote-unquote part was what kind of pushed this over the edge. Like, people took issue with the use of the word immigrant, and, technically I believe they're migrants, not immigrant. It would be migration, not immigration, because there wasn't an existing state or established area to move into. But that the quote unquote indigenous part was the thing that I think kind of sent it over the edge. And
once again, it's the Governor General, the representation of the Queen, the monarchy, and the power of the state. It's not just Joe Schmo or whoever saying these kind of things. To his credit, he apologized and tried to make amends, but sort of further playing into the frustrations of Indigenous people, he did this sort of, I want to apologize to our Indigenous people, which I'm sure he didn't intentionally use the word, but that sort of using the possessive our when you're, again, the representative of the monarch, like now you own them. I get that he's not trying to be racist, but it comes off really sort of within the racist mentality of the state is suppressing Indigenous people. And can we just get rid of the monarchy? Like, that seems like an easier solution now.
Is it though? Like, we just saw the questions of whether or not, Quebec should have some slightly different constitutional arrangements basically be completely shot down, entirely changing the kind of foundation of the Constitution is a pretty big deal. A lot of kind of the general, how the country works is based on legal fictions about what the monarchy does, and that's a whole other can of worms. And then, what do you replace it with? It's complicated. We should probably do an entire deep dive on the monarchy at some point.
But in another Canadian political story, the Senate this week continued its debates over the government's Budget Implementation Act. I think we touched on this last week, or meant to. The Senate has been trying to pass the bill to essentially implement the government's budget. This is something we need to pass before the legislature stands for this summer, or else the government can't spend the money it wants to. And this is complicated because the Liberals stuck their infrastructure bank in their budget bill, but it's not an omnibus because they don't do that because they're not Harper.
Doesn't have omnibus on the title.
There you go. But things got complicated last week with the Senate because there was this motion to split the bill so that the infrastructure bank could be debated separately. And the Speaker ruled that was out of order because the Senate can't originate a money bill. But then the Senate voted to overrule the Speaker And then the person who I think wanted to bring this motion forward was like, oh, can I withdraw it? I've changed my mind. And they're like, no, too late. So they had this vote on splitting this budget bill, which would have raised new kinds of constitutional questions. But it resulted in a tie, 38-38, with Quebecer Mark Gold abstaining. And that tie wasn't broken by the Speaker. It just failed because it didn't get a majority plus one, which is the Senate's convention in this specific case, I guess, on an amendment. And so the budget bill gets to go forward in one piece, and we don't have to have a semi-constitutional crisis at the national level.
Although they did do a sort of money bill thing, too, when they pushed back on the indexing of the federal alcohol excise tax to inflation. And, there's a case to be made there that by splitting that out, that's also money bills from the Senate. Anyway, the House today did kick it back to the Senate after the Senate sent back, and the Senate, I believe at this point, I said, yeah, we'll let it go through as is.
The Senate seems to be taking a sort of, we'll try once to change something, and if the House of Commons, the elected body, says no, then we'll sort of roll over. This happened during the assisted dying debate where there's a lot of pressure. But there's no guarantee they always will. And as senators get more independent, they might decide at some point to really put their foot down, and then we might be in trouble.
Yeah, we've talked a fair bit about the conventions in the last couple of weeks, mostly in the context of BC, but there's seems to be a slight pushing against the edge of the conventions around the Senate at the moment, so it's going to be interesting to watch. Elizabeth May made some news this week from her trip to Berlin, where she was urging European leaders not to ratify CETA. That's the free trade agreement we have with Europe, or that's in the process of getting ratified. I think it was episode 3 we talked about the final negotiations on it, and
the Walloons.
The main reason I want to talk about this is, it's, I think, a little inappropriate for a sitting MP to go overseas and try and encourage foreign governments to take a particular stance on certain things, especially lone opposition MPs.
As far as I could tell with this story, this was Elizabeth May, a Green, speaking before the German Green National Convention. The idea of someone who has a political brand speaking to that brand elsewhere in the world. Like, the Greens are a sort of global movement where the Greens in Germany and the Greens in Canada and the Greens in Australia probably mostly agree that the environment is a good thing, and listening to people and that kind of democratic grassroots stuff. So I'm not convinced this is her trying to win over the German parliament. So I'm not as concerned. I think other parliaments can see the difference between Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, and Elizabeth May, leader of the Green Party of Canada, caucus of one, and go, all right, well, you obviously have your position, you have your stripes. We understand that.
Yeah, and the fact that it was, to a party convention, definitely isn't as bad. Still, I think I generally prefer it if our MPs kind of refrained from trying to do policy overseas, even if it is to a party that has 10 seats. And I don't think this is nearly as inappropriate as Nikki Ashton volunteering on the Bernie Sanders campaign. I don't think it's ideal, but not a huge deal either.
I think the bigger question is who paid for the trip. Was it funded by the German Greens, in which case there's sort of questions about activities there? Was it funded by the Canadian Greens? And if so, was that the best use of their donors' money? I mean, that's up to them.
Leave MPs are required to laud this sort of thing to the Conflict of Interest Commissioner, so... And that has been Politicos. Find links to stories we mentioned in the show notes at politicos.ca. Make sure to subscribe or listen to podcasts, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. Support the show and join the Politicos community at patreon.com/politicos. And if you have any ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks to Mike and Brendan for joining us, and thanks for listening.
Thanks to the Vancouver Public Library for once again lending us their amazing space.